The opening of the nearly $6.5 billion bridge, funded entirely by Canada, is under threat tonight. Donald Trump declaring on social media he will try to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge.
U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening to block the opening of a new bridge linking Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. It's the Gordie Howe Bridge that's supposed to open later this year.
Well, the U.S. president is once again taking aim at Canada, this time threatening to block the opening of a new major trade corridor between Windsor and Detroit.
The opening of the nearly $6.5 billion bridge funded entirely by Canada is under threat tonight. Donald Trump declaring on social media he will try to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening to block the opening of a new bridge linking Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan. It's the Gordie Howe Bridge that's supposed to open later this year. Well, the U.S. president is once again taking aim at Canada, this time threatening to block the opening of a new major trade corridor between Windsor and Detroit. You open your eyes in the morning, pick up your phone, and all of a sudden, a bridge that essentially completed is being used like a bargaining chip in a trade fight, and you're thinking, wait, how does a $6.4 billion project just get blocked overnight? But wait for the twist. While the noise was getting louder online, the real move didn't happen in public at all. Because while Donald Trump was raising questions about stopping the bridge, Mark Carney didn't respond with headlines or speeches. He made a single call, laid out the deal step by step, and in doing so quietly shut down an argument that looked explosive on the surface, but didn't hold up once the facts were examined. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to rewind past the headlines and look at the structure of the deal itself. Because the Gordie Howe International Bridge was never just another infrastructure project. It was a carefully designed economic corridor built to handle around 8,000 trucks every single day, linking Windsor, Ontario directly to Detroit, Michigan, and reinforcing one of the busiest trade routes in the world. The price tag alone shows how serious this was, with roughly $6.4 billion covering not just the bridge span but also customs plazas, highway interchanges, and supporting infrastructure on both sides. And what made it unusual was not the scale, but who paid for it, because Canada financed the entire project upfront, taking on the full construction cost while structuring a deal that gave Michigan something most governments rarely secure, a 50% ownership stake without contributing to the build itself. That arrangement didn't appear overnight or behind closed doors. It was negotiated openly in 2012 between Canada and Michigan under then-Governor Rick Snyder. And the terms were clear from the beginning. Canada would recover its investment through toll revenues over time, and once that happened, Michigan will begin collecting half of the net toll income, effectively turning a zero-cost entry into a long-term revenue stream tied directly to cross-border trade. And this wasn't some overlooked agreement buried in paperwork, because in 2013, the United States Department of State issued the required presidential permit formally approving construction. By 2017, the project had bipartisan endorsement at the highest level, with Trump himself and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau calling it a vital economic link between the two nations, followed by actual federal support in December 2019, when Trump signed legislation that included $15 million in U.S. customs funding tied to the project. So when that February 9th, 2026 post appeared suggesting that Canada owned both sides of the bridge and that the United States needed compensation before allowing it to open, it wasn't just controversial. It directly contradicted a decade of publicly documented agreements, permits, and funding decisions that had already been approved during Trump's own administration. But the post didn't exist in isolation, because it was layered on top of broader trade tensions that had been building, including Ontario's ban on American alcohol sales in provincial stores, long-standing disputes over Canadian dairy protections, and more recently, Carney's trade agreement with China, which reduced Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola from 85% to 15% and opened up an estimated $7 billion in new export opportunities, a move Washington described as hostile and strategically disruptive. In that context, the bridge suddenly became more than infrastructure. It became leverage, at least in theory, because if you frame it as Canada controlling a critical crossing into the United States, then delaying or blocking could be positioned as a negotiating tool in a wider trade dispute. Except that argument ran into a fundamental problem almost immediately, because the ownership structure didn't match the claim. Canada does not own both sides of the bridge. Michigan owns half under the 2012 agreement, and the United States has not been excluded from compensation. In fact, It secured long-term financial participation without upfront costs, while American steel and American workers were directly involved in construction on the Michigan side, making it not just a shared asset, but a shared investment in practical terms. That's why the reaction inside Michigan wasn't divided along party lines. It was unusually unified, because from policymakers to industry stakeholders, the math was too clear to ignore. One of the most direct responses came from Rick Snyder himself, who publicly corrected the claims point by point, emphasizing that Michigan negotiated the deal specifically to secure economic benefits without financial risk, and that blocking the bridge would primarily harm American workers, American businesses, and the state's auto industry. And that last part matters more than it might seem at first glance, because the Detroit-Windsor corridor handles roughly a quarter of all merchandise trade between Canada and the United States. The North American auto industry depends on components crossing that border multiple times before a single vehicle is completed, meaning delays are not just inconvenient. They translate directly into higher costs, disrupted production, and reduced competitiveness. Yet for nearly a century, that entire system has depended heavily on a single crossing, the Ambassador Bridge, built in 1929 and privately owned since 1979 by the Moran family of Detroit, effectively turning it into a near monopoly for heavy truck traffic. Especially since the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel does not allow commercial trucks, forcing nearly every 18-wheeler carrying auto parts, agricultural goods, and manufactured product to rely on that one route. That monopoly generated more than $60 million annually in toll revenue for decades. And when plans for a second publicly owned bridge began gaining traction, the resistance was immediate and aggressive, including roughly $30 million spent backing a Michigan ballot initiative aimed at requiring statewide voter approval for new international bridges, a measure voters rejected by about 60%, followed by multiple federal lawsuits claiming exclusive rights to any Detroit-Windsor crossing, all of which ultimately failed, including an appeal the Supreme Court declined to hear. And even during Trump's first term, when advertisements aired urging him to cancel the project, the administration didn't stop it, instead continuing with regulatory approvals and funding support. Which is why the 2026 threat felt less like a new policy position and more like a sudden reversal tied to a completely different set of pressures. Because if the Gordie Howe Bridge were delayed or blocked, the immediate economic effect wouldn't be abstract. It would be very specific. The continuation of a single point of control over one of North America's most critical trade corridors, preserving a system where any disruption, whether mechanical failure, structural issues, or even a protest blockade, could halt heavy commercial traffic entirely with no real backup. And that's exactly what the new bridge was designed to fix. Not just by adding capacity, but by creating redundancy, something supply chains depend on but rarely have until a crisis exposes a gap. Which is why the project also includes direct freeway-to-freeway connections linking Ontario Highway 401 to Interstate 75, eliminating the need for trucks to navigate Windsor city streets, traffic lights, and congestion before reaching a highway. A University of Windsor study estimated that this change alone could reduce commercial transit times by up to 20 minutes per trip. And when you scale that across thousands of trucks moving daily, the long-term impact becomes massive, with projected savings of around $2.3 billion over 30 years for trucking companies and the industries they support, including American manufacturers and agricultural exporters. So by the time Carney made that phone call, the situation wasn't just political, it was mathematical. Because every argument being made publicly had already been answered in contracts, permits, and economic projections that hadn't changed in over a decade. And instead of escalating the rhetoric, he simply pointed back to those facts one by one, calmly reinforcing what had already been agreed upon. And that's where the tone of the response became just as important as the content. Because instead of turning it into a headline-driven confrontation, Carney framed the bridge as what it had always been intended to be, a shared asset built to strengthen both economies using materials and labor from both countries, financed in a way that minimized risk for the United States while maximizing long-term benefit. By the time he spoke publicly on Parliament Hill, the message hadn't shifted. He described the bridge as a model of cooperation, emphasized its role in supporting commerce and tourism, and even signaled a willingness to keep discussion constructive by involving U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra. And yet, despite that measured response, the White House followed with a statement claiming it was unacceptable for Canada to fully own the bridge, a claim that had already been contradicted by Michigan officials. Snyder's detailed explanation, and the original 2012 agreement itself, creating a situation where the public narrative and the documented reality were moving in completely different directions. That disconnect between rhetoric and reality is where the entire situation began to unravel, because once you move past the headlines and look at the actual structure of the deal, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, especially when the same project being questioned in 2026 had already been described as vital in 2017 and supported with funding in 2019 without any changes to its ownership model, financing structure, or economic purpose. What did change, however, was a broader geopolitical environment, where trade disputes began stacking on top of each other. From Ontario's restrictions on American alcohol sales to long-standing disagreements over dairy protections, and most notably, Carney's agreement with China, which reduced tariffs on Canadian canola from 85% to 15% and unlocked an estimated $7 billion in export potential, a move Washington interpreted as a strategic shift rather than a routine trade adjustment. And in that environment, it becomes easier to see how a physical structure like a bridge could be reframed as leverage, even if the underlying facts don't support that framing. Because when tensions rise, infrastructure stops being just infrastructure and starts being viewed as a pressure point, something that can be delayed, restricted, or politicized to gain advantage elsewhere. But the problem with using the Gordie Howe Bridge that way is that its benefits are not one-sided, and in many cases, they lean heavily toward the United States, particularly at the state level, where Michigan stands to gain significantly from reduced congestion, improved supply chain efficiency, and eventually a 50% share of toll revenues without having financed the initial construction. That's why the response within Michigan went beyond political statements and into direct economic concern, with leaders across the spectrum emphasizing that canceling or delaying the project would have immediate consequences for businesses, workers, and consumers, all of whom rely on the smooth flow of goods across that border. And when you consider that around a quarter of all merchandise trade between the two countries moves through this corridor, even small disruptions can ripple outward into much larger economic effects. The Gordie Howe Bridge changes that equation entirely by adding a second high-capacity crossing with modern infrastructure, direct highway connections, and the ability to handle the kind of volume the existing system has been carrying alone for decades, effectively turning a fragile single-point system into a more resilient network. What makes this even more complex is the dominance of the Ambassador Bridge, which has operated as a near monopoly since 1979 under the Moran family, generating tens of millions of dollars annually and facing a direct challenge for the first time in decades with the introduction of a publicly owned alternative. Because in the end, the bridge didn't stop, the ownership structure didn't change, and the economic case remained exactly what it had been from the beginning. A $6.4 billion investment designed to move goods more efficiently, reduce transit times by up to 20 minutes per trip, and generate long-term savings estimated at $2.3 billion over 30 years, while giving Michigan a 50% stake in a major international crossing without upfront cost. And that raises a bigger question that goes beyond this single project, which is how often infrastructure becomes entangled in political strategy, and whether using it as leverage actually strengthens position or risks undermining the very systems that economies depend on to function smoothly. Do you think this was ever really about the bridge itself? Or was it just a convenient pressure point in a much larger trade conflict? And more importantly, when agreements are already signed and the math clearly favors both sides, should political strategy still have the power to disrupt projects at this scale? Drop your thought below. Subscribe for more.